I'm just going to do a very brief introduction today. We are joined again by Professor Michael Kimmage of Catholic University of America, coming at us from Washington, D.C. And today he will be having a conversation with Joshua Yaffa. So I'd like to just do a quick introduction of Joshua Yaffa, though I'm sure that all of you know him very well. Joshua Yaffa is a Moscow correspondent for The New Yorker, and he is author of Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia, published in January of 2020, which recently won the 2021 Orwell Prize for Political Writing. In accepting the prize, Yaffa said, "The exercise of power in politics, especially in a place like Putin-era Russia, can complicate or scramble the pursuit of a noble, honest life. But life in all its beauty and strangeness remains all the same, even for those who make their own accommodation with the system." Orwell was a constant reference as I try to untangle these stories and tell them with lucidity and, I hope, a measure of literary artistry. Between Two Fires, unquote, sorry. Between Two Fires is about how Putin has sought to redefine the pillars of his rule and legitimacy and what this new age of Putinism means for everyday Russians and Western governments. More specifically, his book looks at the lives of several Russians and the inevitable accommodation they must reach within the system around them. He is currently based in Moscow and is coming at us from Moscow today, and is also reported from Russia for Bloomberg, Business Week, The Economist, National Geographic, The New Republic, and the New York Times Magazine. For his work in Russia, he has been a finalist for a Livingston Award, a visiting scholar at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and received a grant from the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. He was previously an associate editor at Foreign Affairs. He is a graduate of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and holds master's degrees in journalism and international affairs from Columbia University. So please give a warm MSSR 2021 welcome to Joshua Yaffa and Michael Kimmage.
Thank you, Jarlath, and it's a joy to be back again with you, Josh, albeit over Zoom in the Monterey Summer Symposium. I have 4 questions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 2 of them, and then I'll turn the floor over to the students. And if there's a lag or we sort of run out of questions, which somehow I suspect won't happen, then I'll ask my other 2. And I somehow think that these other 2 questions will come up one way or another. Let me just mention very briefly what the 4 questions are. The first is going to be about your role as translator. It's a question I asked you last year, but I think that the world is a bit different has gotten a bit different in the last 12 months. Secondly, about the nature of support for Putin at the present moment. Thirdly, about the nature of opposition politics, both in Russia and Belarus. And then fourth, about the pandemic and Sputnik and the situation currently in Russia. So I want to ask questions 1 and 4, passing over questions 2 and 3 for the moment. And I'll start with question 1. We spoke in this exact same format last year. And one of the things I was eager to ask you about then was your role as translator. There really are not that many voices like yours in the English-speaking world, of people who have a command of Russian culture, who are there in Russia itself and are focusing, of course, you're focusing on politics, but you focus on much more as well. And this speaks to your journalism at The New Yorker, but of course also to your book, which is to a degree a referendum on Putin's Russia, but much more than that as well. It's an exploration of Russia's different regions. You take the sort of Chekhovian mode, the Dovlatov mode, and try, I think, through that to get into Russian life. And my question is, sort of in Trump's period, when everything was so hypercharged about Russia and so politicized, it really felt to me like you had the role of a translator. You were taking things that were in the headlines, things that were outside of the headlines, and you were bringing them to an educated English language audience, while at the same time, all of us were getting bombarded with the sort of heavy politics and also the sort of cliches, caricatures, and distortions that were related to Russia during the Trump period. I wouldn't argue that the last 6 months or 12 months have liberated us from the sort of politicization and from certain kinds of hyperbole that cluster around the discussion on Russia. but it does feel more relaxed to me. And it feels to me like one of the things that Biden is consciously trying to do, and I personally sort of very much support this as a policy initiative, is to return Russia to a foreign policy category and sort of take it out of domestic American politics, and in a way to de-dramatize the US-Russian relationship. I don't think that that makes your role as a translator, if that's how you see yourself, any less significant, but I think it does shift the context if what I'm saying is true. So that's where I wanted to begin, and sort of your sense of what you can accomplish at the moment and what your relationship is to your audience. Because I imagine for you too, it must have changed quite a bit with the change of administration in Washington, and a kind of new spirit that's there in the very early phases of the Biden era.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Jarlath, for the very generous introduction, Michael, for the interesting question, and all of you for being here. Looking forward to the discussion. I think you're right. Well, you're right about a lot in that question, and I'll try to do more than just agree and to add something to it. But one thing that struck me as perceptive, which I hadn't thought about myself, is the notion that my job changes not only in response or in relation to events in Russia as things change here. I mean, clearly that's sort of obvious. As a job as Moscow correspondent, as the situation evolves and changes in Russia, clearly that's going to affect the nature of my coverage and my work and what I write about and what subjects I choose and so on. What I hadn't fully thought about or kind of articulated for myself, but I think it's true that you highlighted, Michael, is that the job also changes depending on what's happening in the US, because half of the equation in my job is writing about Russia for an American, or I think, this day and age, we can say a international or Western English-speaking audience that may be broader than just American, even if the American audience, I think, remains primary for the New Yorker. And that also matters, what's happening with the audience. Maybe it's not exactly a 50-50 split, maybe it's 60-40, 70-30, but it's still not insignificant part of the job is taking into account and calibrating my own coverage based on what's happening in the West, in the United States, among the potential or likely readers of pieces I might write. And that can actually work in one of two ways. I'm thinking back to the kind of prime years of the Trump-Russia era, when there was a lot of focus and interest both among editors and readers on anything to do with Trump-Russia. I think that, to everyone's kind of disappointment, I don't mean politically, but more sort of, I'm not sure everyone's kind of curiosities were sated in terms of the what we kind of found in terms of what was there. But nonetheless, there was a lot of energy directed toward uncovering what that there might be. And that sort of led to two things in my coverage. One was a kind of impulse or need to, quote unquote, feed the beast, right? I sort of had to speak to that reader interest, even if it was to throw a little bit of cold water on the subject, or to caution ways in which that narrative might be getting out ahead of itself. I remember a piece I wrote that I personally was very satisfied with and happy I did, was in, I believe, the summer of 2017, at a moment of acute kind of or heightened speculation about the Trump-Russia issue and all the various links there might be between Trump and Russia and so on, and Kremlin interference in the election. And I wrote a piece about what Russia's leading independent journalists thought of the way American journalists were writing about Russia. These were not people who work for state television. These were not kind of, bought and sold Kremlin propagandists. These were really the creme de la creme of people, I'm sure, who you're reading over the course of this symposium, the best of Russia's independent journalists. And they were really something between confused, dismayed, shocked, aggrieved at how Russia was being covered by the American press. And I sort of just really handed over the piece to them, as it were, right? I let them speak. I let them address what they thought some of the pitfalls or shortcomings were in American coverage. And I was proud of having been able to offer that as in effect, it was a corrective. I don't think that wasn't necessarily my purpose or goal. And when I set out to write it, I really just wanted to call up or go see these journalists and see what they said. It just so happened that all of them, to varying degrees, said they think the American press had really kind of gotten far out ahead of itself and was covering Russia in ways that didn't seem recognizable to the people who sort of do it day in and day out. But that was a way where I was able to speak to the story of the day, but hopefully add something new, useful, interesting. It turned out to be a kind of corrective, though, as I said, that wasn't really my intent in writing it, but my intent was to find a way, what can I add to this story that feels novel and interesting and useful and plays to the fact, as you put it, of me being here and being, just by dint of the time I've spent here, immersed in the cultural, political scene and understanding, kind of having a decent sense of how to navigate that world and how it works. So there were pieces like that. I also wrote a piece I remember from that era that in part focused on the story of this Russian lawyer who ended up at the center of the whole Trump Tower meeting, brouhaha, Natalia Veselnitskaya. And again, my goal was not to kind of come in and throw cold water. I didn't want to play the role of a skeptic. I didn't think that was very useful, nor was that necessarily the best kind of encapsulation of my views about the Trump-Russia story. It wasn't that I was a skeptic. I just approached it like a reporter and wanted to understand, in this case, who was this woman, Natalia Veselnitskaya? How did she end up at the middle of this story? How did she end up at Trump Tower? And I wrote a piece that untangled her long tale that in the end actually intersected with the long, equally convoluted tale of the American, now actually ex-American, financier turned human rights crusader Bill Browder. And that was another story that I felt grateful that I had the time and the space, which the New Yorker allows, to sort of tell a longer, more complicated and nuanced story that spoke to the headlines that people were interested in, but also gave, I think, more detail than people were able to get elsewhere, again, just by dint of the format and nature of the New Yorker. So that's one category. The other category was what you might call counter-programming, which was to sort of play to the heightened interest of, in Russia, the kind of sexiness, as it were, of Russia as a topic in readers' minds, and then give them Russia stories that have nothing to do with Trump, nothing to do with the headlines, but would kind of, would draw people in through that association, through that Russia kind of connotation, and then give them a story that was about the Russia that most interested or fascinated me. For example, I'm thinking of a piece I wrote, it must have been in 2018, I believe, about this small town doctor turned fiction writer, Maxim Osipov, in this wonderfully storybook town of Tarusa outside of Moscow. I'm not even sure the word Putin featured once in that piece. I don't remember, 7,000 words. And if Putin was there, it was maybe one or two in one or two places. And that felt also satisfying to me, to be able to bring to readers the Russia that actually I live in and find interesting, and the Russia that fascinates me, which is, I'm sure for you, Michael, and for many or all the participants of the symposium, it speaks to questions not of kind of the politics of the day. That's not necessarily what I think draws a lot of us to Russia, but it's the culture, the history, the literature, and it was satisfying to be able to get that story into the New Yorker at a time when people were really intensely focused on various Kremlin machinations and their connection to Trump, and so on. Now, as you say, that era is behind us, replaced by what, it's not totally clear. I think there's certainly in minds and in editors' minds, there's still a hangover, as it were, from that previous period we just described. I think a lot of those associations and references still remain in people's minds. They haven't fully disappeared, but at the same time, with Trump gone and the Trump-Russia story gone, at least from the active phase of the headlines, that provides an opportunity to explore Russia in a different way. There's a bit of a blank canvas, although, again, writing even for a non-newsy magazine like the New Yorker, but still actually tries to kind of speak to and address topics of news interest. What's happening in Russia is going to drive the coverage. If in fact, in the previous paradigm, it was almost what was happening in America was kind of driving how we thought about Russia here. We've transitioned to a phase where what's happening in Russia is driving coverage of Russia. And the past 6 months, that's been the story, the kind of combined story of Navalny's poisoning, his return, his arrest, the protests, and then the crackdown not just against the protests themselves, but really the crackdown against wide swaths of civil society that's happened in Russia in response. And if we sort of look at those events as one macro event, that's been the big unignorable story here in Russia for the past 6 months. And so the question for me as this kind of translator, as you put it, is to how to encapsulate that, how to find stories that make legible these changes in Russian politics and society to American readers. I, for one, don't necessarily think that protest reporting, for example, right, really gets at sort of the best vehicle or best kind of canvas for translating that sort of knowledge or information. When I think about playing that translator role and trying to get across to American readers, what is it that's happening here? Why? What are the social and political forces driving things? How is society reacting? How is the political class reacting? For example, as kind of adrenaline filling as it is to go to a protest, and I do, right? It's not as if I sit at home and don't go to the protest as a journalist. I do, but I don't think that that's like the right vehicle for telling the story. So then what stories are there then that make more sense, that would be more fruitful? In this particular case, I found one. I don't know how ultimately successful it was or not, but trying to tell the story of people who, young Russians who, to various degrees, had worked inside the system. One had worked for a social media channel that was linked in various opaque ways to the Kremlin, one all the way to someone who worked for a state-run pipeline company, about people who were disappointed and disgruntled in the system, and that's this period of protest, and going back really to Navalny's poisoning and arrest, had disillusioned them in the system, and they had decided to leave it. And I thought, for example, telling their story, not just of disillusionment, but how was it that for so many years they were kind of okay with the status quo, right? How these were people who were smart, educated, intelligent, kind of had a good head on their shoulders, as it were, and understood a lot about the system long before Navalny's poisoning, the arrest, the protests. They were pretty clear-eyed about the system's failings, its corruption, injustice, and so on. But for various reasons, they found it tolerable or somehow worth it to remain inside the system. But something changed for them. And after this particular season of protest, they found it no longer tenable and no longer tolerable to remain inside the system. And that was a case where, as translator, I thought, if I can kind of locate that reason and explain it to the reader, then I think we'll really, again, my hope, how successful it was, you can all tell me, I don't know, but the hope is that by identifying, locating, and narrating that moment, that kind of phase shift from being able to tolerate the system to no longer being able to tolerate it, and in fact risking, if nothing else, personal livelihood, economic security to leave the system, I thought could get at what exactly is the larger shift at play here, right? What sort of stands behind and motivates these protests writ large? Why is Russian society in a state of political tumult and upheaval right now? What's going on behind the surface? What's going on in the minds of people out in the streets? And I thought, in that case, going to a protest and asking people, why are you here, is interesting and useful. But I thought maybe in looking at these stories of people who had this very dramatic personal change of heart might be more powerful in this kind of translation way that you mentioned. Because I think that the role of a translator, at least in this case, right? I don't know if it's true in the sort of more traditional role of literary translator. I feel less confident speaking about that. But as it pertains to me, I think what makes you a successful translator, what I always try and do, is to demystify the Russia story, to make it seem less like a kind of foreign or alternative parallel universe, right? I think in many readers' minds, and it's understandable, I don't think it's kind of foolish or ridiculous for readers to think this way, but I think many readers, at least in a place like the New Yorker, imagine Putin's Russia as taking place in this alternative realm with a reality that does not oversect or really resemble their own. And I think, or I certainly place a great emphasis in my own work on trying to remove that barrier as much as possible, to show readers, not by kind of beating them over the head with it, but to find stories like, for example, those of the young people I just described, that show the dilemmas, calculations, concerns, stresses, hopes, fears, all of it that Russian people may feel living inside the Putin system. Those are all recognizable, relatable, maybe not exactly universal, but they're not nearly as foreign as Putin's Russia might look or feel on first glance when you think about it in the abstract. So that really is my kind of translation goal, number one, to render into a kind of, I don't want to say American English, it's not so much a linguistic translation, right? But to sort of render these dilemmas, these stories, these predicaments in a way that makes them read as legible and recognizable, not kind of the experiences of some foreign people in a foreign land, although in some literal way that is the case, but to have them feel kind of close to home and relatable, I guess is the word I'm looking for, so that readers feel a measure of empathy with the characters and subjects of my stories, understanding that what they're living through is a lot more familiar and close to home than Putin's Russia may seem like in the abstract. And if I can achieve that, if I can make Putin's Russia feel not like this distant or foreign place, but a place that actually you can kind of understand how people might live and work and operate in it, then I think I've been successful, at least in part, as a translator.
Wonderful. I mean, I think there's been no more damaging phrase in the Anglosphere than Churchill's enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in, sort of shrouded in mystique. Not only is it dangerous for foreign policy to think of other countries in those terms as sort of fundamentally inexplicable, but there are human costs to that perspective as well. It's sort of the exoticizing, almost Orientalist gaze that makes others out of countries that in some ways are comparable or at the very least neighbors. And it's I think a great accomplishment of your journalistic writing that it goes against the grain of that impulse, which I will confess in the city of Washington, D.C. is more Churchillian than Yaffa-esque, but that's what gives you a job to do. Just a quick footnote to the graduate students among us, which is to say almost all of us, if anybody is looking for a good topic for a PhD dissertation, I think that the American sort of journalists in Russia and the Soviet Union would be a wonderful one, going all the way back to George Kennan Sr., not the diplomat, but his uncle, who went to Siberia and wrote a very celebrated book in the late 19th century of the figure of Walter Duranty, who's a very controversial sort of, was corrupted by the Stalin system, and New York Times journalist who sort of didn't tell the story. Then you had Hendrik Smith in the 70s and 80s, who was sort of a big, very popular journalist. And I think a predecessor of yours, Josh, I'm not sure if you see it this way, but Serge Schmemann of the New York Times, who had Russian roots and sort of went back and wrote an interesting book about his Russian family, and I think in his own way has tried and continues to try, is now on the editorial board at the New York Times, to engage in the work of translation. But it would be an interesting thing to explore obfuscation and translation in this very, very long legacy of Anglo-American reporting on Russia and the Soviet Union. But let me move now, Josh, to my second and sort of final question before we begin the discussion with our students about COVID, since it's also been the subject of sort of many interesting pieces that you've written within the last 12 months. As I suspect you are, I'm sort of just confronted, or what confronts me is the strangeness of the story. That on the one hand, Russia sort of reached a vaccine very early on. And as you've sort of argued in your pieces, it seems to be quite good. I know that you yourself have taken the Sputnik vaccine, but rates of vaccination remain perilously low in Russia. Huge quantities of the vaccine have been exported to places like Serbia and elsewhere. And the Delta virus seems to be wreaking havoc at the moment in Moscow. And I wonder if you could just sort of help us to put in perspective the texture of the crisis as it is in Moscow, other Russian places at the moment, and maybe then a few thoughts also about sort of vaccine diplomacy. I've been disappointed in the U.S. government for not doing more with the Russian government, naive as that sort of sounds, but I think there could have been more cooperation in terms of a sort of common vaccine diplomacy, but maybe that's foolish to expect. It seems like there's a degree of geopolitical competition when it comes to the vaccines. I mean, between Russia and the West, but that's just a hypothesis. If you could speak to the sort of national reality of it, but also something of the diplomatic or geopolitical reality of the COVID crisis as it's unfolding before your eyes.
Sure. I think I should say by way of a coda, when I speak about COVID, whether the pandemic itself, the vaccine, it's important to harken back a bit to the first question and talk about my role as a translator, because when it comes to the pandemic, I certainly have felt in a way I haven't in just about any other subject I've covered, that I'm not just a translator, but I'm a participant. I've never felt as involved and implicated in a story as I have in covering the pandemic. And I think that's important to understand in just in making sense of my comments, but also as a way of kind of disclosure. And if we're still kind of interested in the reverberations of the first question, right? And that the pandemic has turned me into a participant, whether I like it or not, of contemporary Putin's Russia in a way that in just about all the other stories I've written, I was this observer translator who didn't feel involved or implicated in the story in the same way. It's certainly very different, say, when writing about Navalny protests, where whatever kind of humanistic sympathies or impulses I might have, nonetheless, I'm pretty clear for myself, and it doesn't require a whole lot of mental gymnastics. It just feels quite obvious that this is not kind of my fight. It's not my crusade. I can have a kind of dispassionate analytical view about what's going on with the protest and the state's reaction to them. Again, even if I have a kind of humanistic impulse, it's not difficult to remain in the role of journalistic observer. With COVID, it's different because I live here. So kind of my health, in a way, my well-being, my safety, right, is wrapped up in all of these issues of culture, politics, public health, and so on that I'm reporting on. And so I'm very much a participant, willing or not. And that, I think, has certainly given me a heightened interest in trying to understand what's happening with Russia and COVID, going back to the beginning of the pandemic all the way through the vaccine. As you mentioned, I've taken Sputnik V. I do actually think it's a credible and effective vaccine. I took it not because I think it's better or preferable than some of the other Western vaccines, but because I took it in December at a time when I was stuck in Russia and was not planning to come to the US anytime soon. And it was the one vaccine available to me. So far, knock on wood, it seems to be doing its job, seems to be working, even as the Delta variant is indeed spreading in Russia. I think the most interesting and maybe important fact for us to talk about relating to Russia and the pandemic, at least circa July 2021, is how and why is Russia in, I believe, and please, Michael or any of the participants of the symposium correct me, but I think Russia is in just about a world unique position of having invented its own seemingly successful vaccine, offered it freely and widely to its citizens, have almost no one take them up on the offer, and then to see the pandemic kind of return for a very costly and very widespread third wave. It really puts Russia in an interesting and unique category. I mean, talk about a field day for sociologists or sort of anthropologists, others who study society, right? In terms of levels of trust, of kind of citizen-state relations, citizen-citizen relations, right? How people see themselves vis-a-vis other members of society. To put it bluntly, to get sick and die of COVID, at least in Moscow, right? We can talk a little bit about the situation in the regions, which is a bit different, but to get sick with COVID and die of COVID in July 2021 is effectively a choice in Moscow. And the fact that there are people who are in effect making that choice is really at once kind of disturbing, but also understandable if you begin to look kind of under the kind of hood, as it were, and understand what's going on kind of historically, culturally, politically. It's not that that's a mystery, I think. I think that we can understand some of the impulses going into that. It's not as if just at the dawn of the pandemic did we see for the first time low levels of trust in society toward any sort of official government structures, right? That's a story that's been going on for a long time. And in a way, it reflects the macro theme of my book, which is about understanding the ways in which outward displays of loyalty or even obedience are not at all, don't necessarily have to be at all matched with kind of inward trust, faith, belief that the state or the system can offer you anything positive and virtuous. So the kind of instinctual muscle for Russian citizens to look out for their own self-interest through avoiding or kind of outsmarting the state is a long-standing one, and the pandemic didn't invent anything new necessarily, but just I think strengthened existing tendencies, and in a way, the Kremlin was, because of the poor state of citizen-state relations by the time the pandemic hit, and certainly by the time the vaccine was rolled out, the Kremlin was in a losing kind of position. In a way, if it didn't try and agitate or propagandize people to take the vaccine, no one would. But in fact, if officials went on state TV and shouted about how everyone should take the vaccine, that also would convince people not to do the vaccine, because people are very correctly, unfortunately, right, attenuated many times to sort of do the opposite of whatever officials are telling them to do on state TV. And these are all deeper issues and deeper problems that are kind of too late to fix, too late to do anything about when the pandemic hits and when the vaccine is rolled out. But nonetheless, as someone who lives in Moscow and whose kind of health is interconnected with the health of my neighbors and fellow Muscovites, it's certainly disturbing to see that 6 months since the rollout of the vaccine, when it's been just about widely and freely available for anyone who wants it inside Moscow, again, we'll talk about the regions in a second, the fact that as of about a month ago, I think we're about 10%. And since then, and since the authorities, especially in Moscow, have added new measures to effectively force wide swaths of the population to get vaccinated, we can talk about that too. But as those measures have taken force, we've ticked up, I think, to about 15% plus. But that's still pretty shocking, and I think pretty unique in terms of the world map today of a country or a sort of large global megapolis that's had widespread vaccine access for 6 months, and over the course of those 6 months has managed to only vaccinate 15% of the population. And I think, and I'll sort of maybe close here because I feel myself kind of repeating myself, which is this question of kind of trust and faith in that the state actually has your best interests at heart, right? I think for reasons that we probably don't have to spend a whole lot of time on here, there is this rather hardened certainty among wide swaths of the Russian population that the state and state officials are not first and foremost concerned about the well-being of Russian citizens. And so we had a situation with the pandemic when essentially, and they're not wrong to think that way, right? That is a sound analytical judgment. But the pandemic turns out to be one of those cases when, what's the expression of a broken clock is right twice a day? It turns out that when Putin says the Russian vaccine works and everyone should go get vaccinated, he's right. But I understand why so many swaths of the Russian population, including, and I'm not here just talking about people with opposition mindset, people with a liberal mindset. I think that's really important to understand. When we talk about low levels of public trust and public faith in the state and in state officials, we're talking about people who are essentially the kind of passive Putin majority, people who are not necessarily enthusiastic rah-rah Putin supporters, of whom there are actually very few left in Russia circa 2021. I think you have a lot more people who tolerate the Putin system and are more afraid of whatever would replace the Putin system than they are of continuing the status quo. But among that contingent, you also have quite high levels of distrust. And in a way, I wrote about this in one of the pieces for the New Yorker, I'm inclined to see the really catastrophic failure of the public vaccination campaign as a more indicative indicator in public trust and public faith in the state than, say, last summer's referendum on the Constitution that saw, first and foremost, Putin gain the right to run for another 2 terms, a staged, managed, and manufactured vote in which the state got the result it needed. But here, I think, with the vaccine, you're looking at a much more kind of genuine or honest plebiscite, as it were, about public attitudes toward the authorities, and the results are not good. And while I completely understand the cultural, political, historical reasons for that, as someone who is living in Moscow, and again, as I said, with kind of my health depending on the general public health situation in Moscow, it's certainly alarming to live in a city that on July 2nd is living through its worst moment of the pandemic ever. There are more cases every day being found in Moscow every day. There are more hospitalizations. There are more people on ventilators. There are more people dying in Moscow and in Russia than at any point since the beginning of the pandemic. What will be interesting to see is whether this policy of mandatory vaccinations, which has begun in Moscow, and like with so many policy questions, what's tested in Moscow is often then implemented out in the regions. You're already starting to see other regions enact their own mandatory vaccination policies. Will that get numbers up to the point they need to be to create some sort of herd immunity? I mean, it can't happen that quickly, right? Even if people suddenly had the desire to be vaccinated. We'll get to the supply question in a moment, but Russia actually doesn't have the supply to suddenly at the blink of an eye vaccinate 140 million people. You're already seeing reports of shortages of dosages out in the regions, and that's been the huge question in terms of Russia's vaccine policy, both domestically and internationally, which is how much vaccine actually is there. In a way, I heard from some analysts that I think this sounds convincing, that in the winter and spring, when demand inside Russia was low and the pandemic itself was actually manageable, the Delta variant hadn't yet arrived, the numbers were not great in Russia, but they weren't catastrophic, that low demand for the vaccine actually suited the authorities just fine because it meant they had spare vaccine to send abroad for this vaccination diplomacy initiative, which is of chief geopolitical interest to the Kremlin. There's only a limited number of amount of vaccine. Russian science, kind of theoretical science, laboratory science, is far out and ahead of kind of industrial science, kind of what biotech science, right? So I'm not surprised that Russian scientists were able to come up with the particular adenovirus vector technology, very similar, for example, to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That's not surprising. It's also not surprising that then Russia has had a hard time scaling that and taking that scientific know-how and producing the tens or hundreds of millions of doses needed both to supply Russia and the rest of the world. So for a while, low demand inside Russia was actually okay because it meant there was the spare vaccine that could be sent with great fanfare to Argentina or parts of Africa, Middle East, what have you. Now, though, we're entering into an interesting moment because of the Delta variant, vaccination domestically is an urgent political priority. As I said, we've seen the mandatory vaccination orders in Moscow and elsewhere. So clearly they're now pushing people actively to be vaccinated, but there is a kind of zero-sum ceiling as to the amount of vaccine available. So certainly Russian producers have gotten better at making it by the summer than they were in the winter or spring. So there is some scaling up, but we've also seen this sort of zero-sum nature remains. For example, Guatemala has requested, if not sued, I forget the exact legal formulation, but essentially Guatemala has now publicly claimed they've not gotten the promised doses of Sputnik V that Russia was contractually obligated to provide it with, and it wants its money back. So clearly the supply issue is problematic, and I think Russia is going to have to choose, if it's not already choosing, how does it split the supply between domestic orders and international ones. And that puts Russia in a hard place because now actually it can't really fail on either front. Because of the Delta variant, it has to vaccinate the population, at least to a sort of meaningful or significant degree inside Russia. Otherwise, there really will be collapse of the healthcare system. Moscow itself is just about already on edge or sort of at the limit of what its hospitals can handle. And Moscow actually has quite impressive hospital capacity, not just compared to the rest of Russia, but compared to much of Europe. And Moscow is bursting at the seams. So it has to vaccinate the domestic population, but it can't have too many stories like this Guatemala one, or else its whole vaccination diplomacy program starts to look like a failure. And that's a kind of geopolitical impossibility, I think, as far as the Kremlin is concerned. So I think the numbers game with vaccines is going to start to get tricky pretty soon if it hasn't already. And they sort of now, for both reasons of public health and diplomacy, need to provide vaccine here and there, but there just might not be enough of it to go around.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of that. I think the time is good now to turn to our students and see what questions they have really of any kind about journalism, about sort of politics, translation. It's all fair game.